Hi, my name is Mike Gant, and this is episode 26 of Bible Mechanics. And last time we were talking about synagogues, ancient synagogues, and churches, and about how these were groups that gathered together to hear the scriptures, to pray, and to encourage each other. And it began in the period of time after Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. They've been dispersed throughout the world. So this was a way that they could they could keep alive the hope that they had for their nation and specifically for the coming of Messiah. So that at the time of Jesus, when Messiah actually came and he sent his apostles out to report this fact, and bear witness to his resurrection from the dead, the first place that they went, according to the records that we still have, were synagogues. Now, along the way, synagogue came to mean a building, just like church eventually, or started off meaning just a group of people and eventually came to mean a building. And I think today people will use the term in both ways, that synagogue or church can be speaking of a building or a group. But in the beginning, they were just groups of people. And synagogue being the term that we use to apply to Jewish groups, and church being the one we apply to Christian groups. But both groups were messianic groups, that is, about Messiah. The Jewish synagogues were about Messiah's coming, and the churches were messianic groups about Messiah's coming again. And these organizations helped illiterate people know what was said in writing. And that's how people who maybe literacy rates were low could still know everything practically there was to know that was in the Bible, because they would hear it being read each week. Usually it was males who were taught to read, and so you'd have a reader in the church, and you can see in the Bible there are references sometimes to the reader, what the reader should do, and that was the person that would be up front. Of course, when we gather together today to have a Bible study, say, everybody usually has their own Bible, and we take that for granted, but that wasn't the case back then. Now, at these meetings, whether it was a synagogue or church, they had, let's just focus on the synagogues first. They would have usually some sort of lectionary, which is a list of the order in which they would read things. The Old Testament began with the books of Moses. There were the wisdom books and the books of the prophets. And so they would have readings each week. And we see that practice transferred over to churches, where you're reading from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And usually the New Testament, you have a reading from the Gospels and from the epistles. And so this was the way that it was like a Bible reading plan, only it was the Bible reading plan for a lectionary is a Bible reading plan for the reader to know what to read on a given week. At the synagogue, it'd be on a Saturday. At the church, it would be on a Sunday. The Jews originally met on Saturday because that was the last day of the week. That was the Sabbath, the day of rest. So that was the time they could get off from work and they could all gather together. Christians came to venerate the first day of the week because Sunday was the day Jesus rose from the dead. And that was how they commemorated that. But both groups had lectionaries, and they weren't identical in every church. They would have, some churches might not have all the scriptures in the very beginning. They might not have all the books of the Bible. They kept them in scrolls. They were expensive. They were bulky to store. And so that's how they would be, they would be read. And that's the order in which they were read. And this is how we came to have an Old Testament and a New Testament. Like the Old Testament in Jesus' day, those books were known, and there was a Jewish historian named Josephus and he wrote about the books that the Jews used, and they're the same ones we use today. Now, we order them a little bit differently, and we sometimes break them up differently and call them different names. We have 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, whereas they might have one book called Samuel Kings, and it was all there together. And when the New Testament came along, when those writings started circulating, churches would read from them, and then as new ones were written, they would accumulate them. They would copy. Everything was hand copied back then. There's no printing press, and they would write down every word that they had, and it would be copied from church to church. And over time, all the churches accumulated the same books. Now, there was a lot of Christian literature being written, but it wasn't all read in church. It was just writings from the apostles that would be read in the churches, because the synagogues read just the books of Moses and the prophets. Likewise, the churches would read from the New Testament, or what would become the New Testament, only the Gospels and the epistles. Of course, Acts was in there too, but people usually thought of it in terms of Gospels and epistles. And it ended up being 27 different writings, and they would read them and they would pass them down from generation to generation. And that's how we know which books belong in the New Testament, because it was the books that were being read in the first century when they first came out. Because, for example, the Apostle Paul, he would write a letter. He'd send it with one or two of his co-workers, say Timothy, maybe Silas. They would go deliver the letter. They might even be the reader that day themselves. But whether they were or they weren't, they could answer questions that the congregation had about the letter. Well, what did Paul mean about this? And Paul didn't put anything in the letter about where he's going next. Where's he going next? They could have all sorts of interaction about it. So it's a very public event when a letter was introduced to a congregation. They knew who it was from. Now, some of the New Testament books have enough information in it to tell us who wrote it, in the letter itself, who wrote it and who delivered it. But some of them don't. For example, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't have the names of the writer in the text itself. So obviously, when those texts began being read in churches, that's information that wasn't written down in the text, but still everybody knew who it was. It's not like they were going to start reading some anonymous text that just showed up on somebody's doorstep one morning. Hey, Ethel, look what I found at the doorstep. What is it, Herman? Well, it looks like a gospel. Who wrote it, Herman? Myrtle, I don't know who wrote it. It doesn't say. But let's take it down to the church and let's read it next Sunday. You're not an elder, Herman. How can you decide that? Oh, Myrtle. And, these things didn't, it's not like nobody's going to take an anonymous, hey, I don't know where this came from, but it sounds really neat. Let's read it. As if it's a gospel, as if it belongs here alongside the prophets. No, they knew they weren't going to be reading books they didn't know the source. Do you like to get your information from anonymous sources, or do you like to know where they come from? Of course you want to know where they come from. So ancient synagogues and ancient churches are the means by which we know who wrote the books of the Bible. Because even when the name is in the Bible, that doesn't mean we can know that that person really wrote it. We just need to know that person's name is in it. We need whoever got them the first time around to verify that that's the source they came from. And of course, these people had every reason in the world to want to make sure that the documents they had were valid, and they didn't want to have any invalid documents, inauthentic. They didn't want to have anything that was any fakes, any forgeries. They would be dead set against that. And there were forgeries back then, but they got weeded out because people would figure out that it was a forgery, and then they would kick it out. Yeah, there were a lot of forgeries. In fact, there were more books rejected than were actually accepted for the New Testament. There were 27 accepted, and there were more than 100 that could have been accepted. but they weren't deemed to be authentically from the apostles. So don't underestimate the importance of these ancient synagogues and churches, these groups of people, because it's their wisdom to receive and treasure these texts and pass them down from generation to generation. And of course, every generation had to exercise care and wisdom to pass them down to the next one. And so we have family Bibles today that get passed down from one generation to the next. That's how we know who wrote the books of the Bible.